Let's review the basic anatomy of a neuron. I expect you to already know this. This should have been taught to you in your anatomy class. But just to review, we have out here these feathery-like branches of a tree. And these are our dendrites. And in fact, dendrites mean branches. The information that the neuron receives will enter first through the dendrites. It's the dendrites that detect the signal. They're the ones that contain the receptors that are going to respond to the chemical messengers that are released onto those dendrites. And I should specify here that it's usually chemical messengers. We can also sometimes get things like stretch or compression. Other types of mechanical force, or we can have things like thermal energy, light, and other types of stimuli that activate receptor proteins within those dendrites. Once the information is received by the dendrites, it's going to be passed into, generally speaking, passed into the cell body of the neuron. As shown here, another name for the cell body is soma. That information will then travel through the soma to my axon. It is converted in the dendrites and in the soma. It's actually converted into electrical energy. And we'll take a closer look at this later in the lecture. And that electrical energy will travel down the axon until it gets to these branches. Now, these larger branches are referred to as contralateral axons or branches. And then these smaller branches are simply collectively referred to as the axonal terminal. But we also can call these, or we can refer to this portion here as I frequently call them nerve endings, or nerve terminal. And it's these segments here, these little tiny bulbous-like structures, which I'm kind of coloring in blue. These little tiny portions here are actually the portion of the neuron that's going to form one half of a synapse, and we'll look at those in more detail. These next few slides just look at the 4 major anatomical classes of a neuron, and this is material that I'm not going to test you on. My purpose in showing you these neurons is to help you to understand that neuronal structure is fairly diverse. And some of them, such as this particular neuron that you're looking at, looking through it in a microscope, you really can't tell which one is the axon and which one is the dendrite. All of these processes look very similar to one another. We see a lot of these in the brain and in special senses. There's a lot that we're still learning about those particular neurons. And again, just as a reminder, these aren't going to show up on your test. I just want you to be comfortable with the different structures that you can see. This is a bipolar neuron. It's got the dendrites, which actually converge into this one dendritic process, which will then carry the information into the cell body, and then of course from there into the axon and into the axonal terminals or nerve terminals. This neuron is very common in the sensory nervous system, and you'll see me draw this particular type of neuron when we talk about the sensory nervous system. And what's really interesting about this one in particular is you see my dendrites here, right? And that's where your receptors are going to be for these sensory receptor neurons. Okay, this is where your protein receptors are located, and they're the ones that respond to chemicals or stretch or thermal energy, light energy, and so forth. And then that information is funneled inward, but instead of converging onto a dendritic process, this portion right here is actually the axon. So we have the axon, and the axon continues, and it goes right past the cell body and continues on down. And so the interesting function of that is essentially removes the cell body from the signaling process. It's important in the sensory nervous system because it makes signals more likely to generate a response or to be detected. And we'll talk more about those when we get to the sensory nervous system. But they're very interesting neurons. This is the classic neuron that most people, when you think about a neuron, this is what you think about. And this is the multipolar neuron that we saw with my dendrites in my cell body and my axons. So here's my dendrites, my cell body, and my axons. These classic neurons are actually our motor neurons that go to the skeletal muscle, and quite a few other types of neurons that or other uses for these multipolar neurons, and we're going to see those.